our activities. And our association is following the situation that is going on in some of the ASEAN countries and in the ASEAN as a whole. We had seminars during the pandemic with Vietnam, with Malaysia, and we were able to give our associates the possibility to know better the situation in those countries. Now we are very happy because we have this seminar on Singapore. Two main speakers. First one is Ambassador Raffaele Langella. Thank you very much, Raffaele, for the cooperation, the collaboration, and for your presence here. And Professor Simon Tai. Thank you so much, Professor Tai. You are the leader in Singapore of the Center of Research on International Affairs, and you are professor, also law professor at Singapore National University, and thank you very much for your presence and your leadership. This seminar will be followed by another seminar in the month of July. July the 9th will be the day of the seminar on Thailand. So the fourth seminar on the country situation in the different ASEAN framework. I would like to thank all the participants, and I would like to thank also all those who are helping us to make this event possible. So first of all, the Italia-ASEAN Association. I chair the Italia-ASEAN Association with the two vice presidents, Ambassador Pipan and Professor Orlandi, and the Secretary General Alessia Mosca. Thank you all for your cooperation. Thank you, Valerio Bordonaro. You are organizing this seminar today. And as you said, I would like to ask all the participants to be in mute and to help us to make all this work in the perfect technological way. So thank you very much for doing so. After the two introductory speeches, we will have time for a round of Q&A. So I would like to ask all of you, if you wish, to ask the organization, so Valerio Bordonaro, if you wish to take the floor and to ask short questions, to give the possibility to Ambassador Langella and Professor Tai to answer. 11 o'clock will be the end of our event. So I stop here. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for also being with us, ICE, Confindustria, the ministries, Ministry for Foreign Affairs, Ministry of Economic Development. Thank you so much. I repeat, please mute. It is decisive for a perfect and well-working activity. And I stop here immediately. I give the floor to Ambassador Raffaele Langella for the first introductory speech. Raffaele, thank you very much. You have the floor.
Thanks a lot, President. Thanks a lot, Enrico, and good morning, everyone. Let's start from the background. I mean, you all know what happened in Singapore in the last 2 months, but maybe it's better to summarize it a little bit. Singapore has been one of the first countries in the world to be hit by COVID-19. And the first case surfaced in January, 23rd. And the reaction of the authorities, of the government, was extremely effective. Those days, remember, in Italy, in Europe in general, COVID-19 was considered as something very distant. There was no immediate threat to the European safety net. Then in Singapore, the reaction was brilliant. I remember all the embassies were involved in the management of the sanitary crisis. I mean, with a lot of transparency and a lot of effectiveness. I still remember, it sounds quite paradoxical now, that the advice they gave us was to be very careful about hospitals and the admissions in the hospitals. As you know, Singapore had been quite badly hit by SARS in 2003. So they were building upon a huge experience in dealing with this kind of infectious diseases. In a few weeks, Singapore became, I would say, the poster boy of the fight against coronavirus. I mean, it became the gold standard when it comes to the management of the sanitary crisis, together maybe with Taiwan, Hong Kong, and later on South Korea. And then something happened. I mean, you must have read that we had two different waves of contagions. The first one was mostly made of imported contagions, people coming from outside, people coming mostly from Europe and North America, a lot of foreigners, but mostly, I will say, Singaporean citizens and permanent residents coming back home in order to avoid the lockdowns in their respective countries abroad. And the second one, which has been maybe even more visible from outside, has been the outbreak of the pandemic in the so-called dorms, these hostels where some 400,000 people, low-wage workers, so-called migrant workers, are hosted in Singapore. On the outbreak of the COVID-19 in the dorms, a lot have been written. I mean, and I found it quite a bit annoying to see the kind of description some newspapers, even most prestigious newspapers, gave of Singapore. Indeed, there is no country that can finger point Singapore when it comes to migrant workers. I mean, and we are all involved in this. I mean, migrant workers are everywhere. Migrant workers are in Europe. Migrant workers are in the most advanced countries in Europe. And the problem of COVID-19 among migrant workers is something that all European countries have to deal with. But still, Singapore lost apparently its aura of invulnerability and invincibility when it comes to dealing with the pandemic. And the same visibility that Singapore got when the authorities were able to fight against the coronavirus very effectively became a source of troubles because, I mean, Singapore was still in the spotlight, but this time for different reasons. Who are the migrant workers? We are talking about some 400,000 people who come mostly from Bangladesh and other Asian countries, Sri Lanka, Pakistan, whose wage is lower than 2,200 Sing dollars per month, so 1,400 euro, so I mean 1,300 euro. They can stay in Singapore for 2 years. They can, of course, renew their working pass, but they will never become permanent residents or citizens of Singapore. On the migrant workers, as I said, a lot of cynicism has been displayed all over the world. There are two issues, I mean, that are, in my opinion, relevant when it comes to migrant workers and Singapore in particular, which deserves a little bit of attention. First of all, a safety system cannot be stronger than its weakest part. The mechanism that Singapore had been set in place in order to fight against coronavirus was extremely effective. There was a weak part in it. And that part became extremely dangerous also in political terms. I would like to remind you that on the 10th of July, Singapore will go to the polls. There will be the general elections. And the outbreak of COVID-19 in dorms could have become quite a serious political issue. You know that after September 11, after 2001, I mean, securityism has become a sort of ideology. Now the new moral ground is safety, maybe. And the way governments preserve the safety of their population, the public opinion, is becoming more and more important. And of course, Singaporean authorities are very well aware that they will have to perform in order to avoid a spillover of the epidemic outside the dorms. Second, it's quite paradoxical. Singapore, as you know, is one of the smartest cities in the world. I mean, one of the most advanced and one of the best infrastructure, not only heavy, but also light infrastructure. And paradoxically, we understood that even the smartest city in the world, at the end of the day, has to rely on an army of low-skilled and low-wage workers. I mean, there is no camera that can work if the grass grow more to up to a certain point. I mean, there is no traffic light which can be maintained without a certain kind of workers. And this is, as I said, quite a reminder of the weakness of the concept of smart city itself. I mean, smart cities needs a strong infrastructure, a lot of investment, and at the end of the day, their performance depends quite a lot on the performance and the availability of this kind of low income and low skilled army of workers. All in all, COVID-19 has exposed the weakness and the strength of Singapore, more strength than weakness. Let's start from the strength, I mean, because they are more easily recognizable. First of all, the excellency of the research, technology, and university system in Singapore. For instance, take the Temasek constellation. I mean, they were among the first one to develop test kits for COVID-19. I mean, we benefited from the cooperation with Singaporean authorities. We were given 30,000 swabs at maybe the most difficult moment of the pandemic in Italy. So, I mean, we were very, very grateful. And this was possible because there was no shortage of such devices in Singapore, at least at the time. So the technological readiness and scientific readiness of Singapore was brilliant. Second, Singapore has a very strong infrastructure when it comes to TLC and, as I said, smart cities and smart working. That's why, for instance, a lot of companies here in Singapore were able to keep going and keep working thanks to the availability of such resources. I mean, the Italian Chamber of Commerce here in Singapore has implemented a very interesting pilot project with 19 Italian companies, small and medium-sized enterprises. They have a new platform for e-commerce, and it's going extremely well. And this is possible thanks to the fact that here in Singapore, everything is available, from human resources to technological infrastructure. Finally, I mean, Singapore is extremely resilient. The government was able to put aside, or better, to invest some 93 billion Sing dollars to support the economy in this difficult phase. And for once, the slogan, the motto, nobody will be left behind, has not been a political slogan. I mean, every single family, I will say, every single company has received some form of support from the government, even foreign companies. There has been a recent survey from the European Chamber of Commerce, which showed that some 58% of European companies in Singapore has received some form of compensation of the losses or some form of help from the government, even if they were not Singaporeans. So it's been a very challenging and wide intervention to support enterprises. Take into account that 93 billion Sing dollars were taken from national reserves. So, I mean, it was still possible for Singapore to be very resilient. I mean, they had huge financial resources to invest in this effort. But still, I mean, to give you an idea of the magnitude of the intervention, it's some 20% of national GDP. So it's something really monumental, I would say. As I said, COVID-19 also highlighted some weaknesses of the system. We already talked, we already touched upon the dependency of the system from a huge army of foreign workers, these migrant workers. I mean, the government is already working in order to better their position, and I'm sure that in a couple of months or a couple of years at maximum, I mean, their condition will change for good. But unfortunately, there is more than this in the picture. I mean, as you know, already in 2019, the economic performance of Singapore was not brilliant. I mean, the growth was 0.2% or something like this. Because of the COVID-19, the growth will shrink in the coming months. I mean, we expect to shrink GDP by 4 to 7%. Unemployment will rise. I've been informed the government estimates that there will be something between 100,000 to 150,000 job losses. So this was already quite a critical period for Singapore, and the risk factors outside Singapore were already quite numerous. The trade wars between China and the US, I mean, have affected quite a lot the economic performance of Singapore. But more in general, Singapore is well known to be an interconnection economy. I mean, Singapore prospers when it can be interconnected to a wider framework, which is made of free flows of capital, goods, and people. That's why Singapore is particularly exposed to external shocks. Take what could be considered a sort of a metaphor of Singapore, Changi Airport. I mean, it's based on free flows of people and goods and so on. Changi Airport, only in the month of March, has seen activities fall by 70%, which is a lot. And Singapore Airlines has lost some 90% of their flights. So I mean, it's been quite a nightmare for the Singaporean economy. The port is by and large the same. And at the very beginning of this crisis, I mean, going to Marina Bay and give a look to the huge amount of ships which were waiting to be assisted in the port was quite saddening. So this ice age, I mean, the crisis of COVID-19 has been interconnected with the reaction of the authorities to the epidemic itself. I said before that Singapore prospers only if it is interconnected. And unfortunately, I mean, it was necessary for the government to cut this kind of interconnections. So European workers or foreign workers working in Singapore were not allowed to leave the country because they were not sure to be able to come back. People from abroad were not allowed to enter the country. So there has been a sort of the economy and the society has been frozen for a few weeks. And I mean, this has affected quite a lot the performance of companies and also I would say the mood of expats living here in Singapore. Take into account that, for instance, the Italian community was one of the fastest growing up to January. We used to grow at a pace of plus 10–15% per year. Nowadays, I mean, a lot of people has decided to leave for good Singapore because they are not in a position to work in the area. Most of the people who live in Singapore, they are supposed to look after the wider region, which is mostly overlaps with ASEAN, the ASEAN region, not Southeast Asia. And this is quite bad news, in my opinion, for Singapore, because this is a moment in which Singapore should exploit some of the most important trends which are happening in the world, in this part of the world in particular. Take Hong Kong. There are a lot of companies who are leaving Hong Kong because the situation is going to change most likely for good in that town, in that area. They are planning to move to Singapore. At the moment, for them, it's impossible to do so. So I am afraid that unless the government do not understand that this kind of restrictions have to be released, the sooner the better, also this opportunity will be lost. That's why I still think that, I mean, Singapore will continue reacting very effectively to the emergency, but they will do maybe something more in order to be sure that this kind of interconnections will work also in the coming future. I will stop here. I think I spoke for 50 minutes. just to close, I would like to remind a reflection that we were doing with a friend of mine yesterday evening. We do not know whether these changes are definitive changes or transitory. I mean, maybe it's a strategy. Maybe Singapore has decided to become a sort of Monte Carlo in Asia. That's why, I mean, I'm very curious to know the opinion of Professor Tai, because if it's not a temporary situation and it's the result of the implementation of a strategy, I wonder what the Singaporean economic system will become in a few months from now. Thanks a lot, and waiting for your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Raffaele. I think very, very interesting. And I'm sure that the 100 people connected with us will be very happy to take note of all your comments and maybe to participate in the Q&A. I add also that in the webinar, we are very happy to host also the President, the Secretary General of the Italian Chamber of Commerce of Singapore. Thank you very much for being with us. It's very useful for all of us. And now I give the floor. I'm very happy to give the floor to Simon Tai. Thank you so much, Simon Tai, for being with us. I think your contribution is highly expected. You have the floor. Thank you.
Oh, thank you very much. Good afternoon to you in Italy. Good morning to you in Italy, and good afternoon from Singapore. I'm facing a slight technical problem. I can't see any of you, and I can't see my slides. I can hear you, and I hope you can hear me. So I will proceed. But if my slides are a bit out of sync with what I'm saying, I hope you understand. Thank you again for inviting me. I'm going to talk a little bit about Singapore. I won't actually try to overlap too much with the ambassador. I respect what he said, and he's entitled to his views. So please allow me to just say my own background, a bit about how I see Singapore, and then about the region, because I think the ambassador has pointed out a very important issue about the Singapore economy. We are very open. We're a hub city, and we're very regional. So in a sense, we can never really see the Singapore economy as a thing to itself. We must see it in terms of the overall picture and the whole region. The SIA, the Singapore Institute of International Affairs that I chair, is well positioned to talk about this because we work very much in our region, and we have been part of the think tanks. We led the process to put up a recommendation to the ASEAN summit. So in that later part, I'll talk about that. And the ambassador also mentioned how the situation of the Sino-American tensions and the overall question mark on globalization, I'll touch on that too. But at the start, let me just, without repeating what the ambassador said, just punch up a few points. The situation in the foreign workers' dorms is serious. It was taken seriously. And first, we have offered all these foreign workers free medical care at the same level as the Singaporeans. And more than that, while the numbers of infected cases were high, the mortality rates have been very low. This is because, first, the numbers were high because we increased the testing. And the nature of this virus is the more you test, the more you tend to find. I'm very happy that the medical care of Singapore capacity has not been exceeded. It was never swamped by too many cases. At the present time, the numbers in the foreign workers' dorms are falling under control. And there's only, I think, one case in intensive care unit in the whole of Singapore. So the situation has been bad, but is rapidly coming under control. And I think that's what the resilience that Ambassador Raffaele mentioned. I think this has been a humbling thing, and all governments have to be humble. Even as Germany reopens, foreign workers in a meat packing factory have had a problem, a spike. We've got to be humble, nimble, and then respond to new challenges. And I think we've gone through part of that learning curve. There'll be more lessons ahead, no doubt. The second part I want to make sure that is understood by an audience sitting in Italy is that this foreign dorm worker problem has been tackled, but there's been very little cross-infection to the overall community. So even though our national numbers are high, most of the numbers were among that foreign worker dormitory. The actual infection rates in Singapore among Singaporeans, permanent residents, most of the expats, has been quite stable and quite low. It presently is in the single digits, which is why our Prime Minister feels that it's okay to call for elections. Otherwise, his time will run out. We can talk about that a bit later. It's unusual. Some countries have done it. Some Singaporeans don't think it needs to be done. But my point about it is not so much whether we should call elections, is that there's been no cross-infection and the Singapore community numbers have been relatively stable. The other factor is that we have locked down for a while and we've used this time. Yes, we took an economic hit, but this time has been very important because we have increased our testing capacity. We've actually made sure that we're able to test much higher per million than in any country in our region. And also, we are now like in the per million in the top 5 or 10 in the world, depending on the rates you look at. And additional to testing, we've increased our capacity to house patients, especially those with fairly no symptoms or low condition symptoms. And as I said earlier, for ICU, we're not overtaxed. So in the sense, though we've paid a price, all countries pay a price to lock down, we've tried to use the time wisely, to use that cost to build up the capacity to test and to treat more people. Because we think that as we reopen, as the countries around us reopen, there will be more risks. And whether it's us or other countries, we must be prepared to deal with the spike that might come again. So that's roughly our attitude to where I would add to what the ambassador has said. He's also mentioned the Singapore system for contact tracing. Many countries are doing this. I think South Korea is perhaps the world's best. We are quite close to it. We have been learning from SARS to really try to make sure that we can trace people using, so that if one person is found infected, we quickly track who we have seen in the last 14 days, contact them and see whether they are showing symptoms, test them, and make sure that all these things do not multiply, so the reproduction rate is kept low. If I could have the next slide, I'll talk a little bit about the issue regarding the budgets. I think the ambassador already pointed this out. This is, our words of our ministers, unprecedented. It's almost 20% of the GDP and virtually doubles the government expenditure for a normal year. Normally, we spend about $100 billion. This year, we'll spend about $193 billion. And I think this is the important thing to say, that Singapore has the reserves. We've built up and kept the reserves so that we're not printing money. We're not even borrowing massive amounts. We have the money. I think this will be important to provide that stability as we go out. And the next slide, please, is that the question is not only just now about the what do we do? Because stability is one thing, but like a ship, it can be stable but going nowhere, and that's a not very good place to be. And here I want to return the point about our integration connectivity. And I think the ambassador raised a very good point. Is this a temporary pause or is this permanent? Let me talk first about Singapore's plans, because the other question about globalization is a bit, it's not within our control. Singapore fully intends to reconnect to the world. We understand that our growth is because we are a hub. In fact, we're concerned that the world to come doesn't see the value of hubs and globalization will take a hit. So politically, economically, we're pushing forward with free trade. Now, in particular, our infrastructure will be upgraded. It will be slightly slower because the demand will go down. Our plans to upgrade and build a new terminal at Changi Airport, to upgrade and build a mega port to handle shipping, all these are at the moment planned to go ahead. We've not taken them off the plans for the future. And generally speaking, our government delivers on infrastructure what they plan. We have, in a sense, a task force. The name tells you everything. Headed by one of our young ministers, this is called the Emerging Stronger Task Force. I've lived in this country and dealt with policy since the Asian crisis of 1997. In each crisis, though we've struggled, we've been hit, we've emerged better, sharper. And we are looking for trends and how we can get ready to grow the trends, like online. The image there shows you the online trend that was already there to enhance our logistic capabilities in this time. And of course, to work with ASEAN. Now, working with ASEAN, if I can have the next slide, won't be easy. ASEAN really, like all regions, has been a bit on the back foot. When the crisis hit, whether it was Italy or our region, the regional organizations really weren't able to be the front and center. It was the national governments that really had to provide the main impetus for the response. So I'm not going to pretend to you that ASEAN has done some things that the EU cannot. I think both regional organizations, all regions have taken a second seat compared to the national governments. But what ASEAN provides is a couple of base-like mechanisms. One is really to have an emergency communication and to try to keep some of the trade flows going, the supply chains. There were some initial impacts, a bit of panic, frankly, among our neighbors. I think now the understanding that ASEAN supply chains must continue is critical. The second is that they've had a number of meetings to really exchange dialogue and numbers. Now, again, ASEAN is very diverse. Our medical system, I would say, is a very strong one. We geared it up against SARS earlier on. And because of our wealth, we have a strong system. We have a large number of doctors per million. The numbers in Indonesia, which is big and a big economy, but is much lower percentage. And in poor countries of ASEAN like Laos, they have fallen further behind. But ASEAN provides a baseline of cooperation. I think that's important to emphasize. And in that sense, we are working with ASEAN to increase the trust for reopening, because our country, though we are concerned like everybody else with safety, public health safety, we understand the need to reopen, and we've already started our first moves. The next slide, please, Sarah. So we understand the trade problem, and we have now tried to make sure that the supply chains can continue in ASEAN. ASEAN is taken together as the 5th largest economy in the world, and it's become actually more integrated. Our think tank is actually involved with the ASEAN Secretariat to push forward the midterm report and to emphasize how ASEAN should redouble our efforts to have a seamless transaction and to increase digital economy. And I'm glad to say that all countries, even though they're very diverse, are on board with this. I think ASEAN will come out of this more integrated than it was before. The next slide, please. Additional, we faced a challenge of the strategic balance, that Sino-American tensions have really started before and have gotten much even worse. And as you know, ASEAN countries are physically close to China. They have a border of them. Some of them are allies with America. So really, there was always a danger, and there still remains a danger, that we could side too much with one or the other. I think, though, that ASEAN countries are very aware of this, and they feel the squeeze of the tensions. And so ASEAN helps provide a degree of strategic autonomy amidst this superpower rivalry, so that none of us are permanently on one side or the other. In fact, just today, Singapore has made a very concrete decision about our 5G infrastructure. And we can talk about that later if there's a particular interest to you. We've made it more on rational grounds rather than geopolitical, but it will need to be explained to many friends. If I could have the next slide, we can talk a little bit about some of the forward-looking efforts. Here in ASEAN, I think the ambassador said it very well. Migrant workers became already a flashpoint in Singapore, but really are a phenomena across the region. Some estimates are Malaysia has probably more than 1 million foreign workers, legal or undocumented, from Indonesia alone. And the conditions of their living is probably as bad or maybe even worse, because they are more informal, than Singapore's dorms. In fact, it's probably worse. That's why we get the more foreign workers trying to come to Singapore. Similarly, even Thailand, it's both a sender of workers overseas, but a recipient of Cambodians, Myanmar, and again, a lot undocumented. So this is an area where ASEAN will need to strengthen the social systems and the healthcare systems. Next, please. In conclusion, I think that really ASEAN has done what it can. It can do more. And one of the big things they're doing is to help everybody understand the need to exchange numbers, to verify systems, as more and more countries are starting to open up in this period. Some countries, frankly, like Indonesia, are doing it without a true control over the level of infections. They're doing it for economy. I mean, all of us feel the pressure, but I think some of us are balancing the health with the economy better than others. So we will have to keep monitoring each other and hopefully encouraging others to do more. On China, I think ASEAN has played a very good role to really enlarge the situation so that we are able to say to China, not just China help us, but working in the ASEAN +3 with Korea and Japan, both of whom have done quite well in this time too. One point which I think I may not have a slide is to talk a little bit about one of the efforts we're making in terms of the creation of green lane and bubbles. This is a term which has just emerged, so let me explain them simply as being special arrangements to allow travelers to go through, having pre-checked they will not be quarantined, therefore you don't have to spend 2 weeks in quarantine before you do business. We've already signed our first agreement with China, touching with six Chinese cities or provinces. And we expect that as China's situation, assuming this Beijing outbreak can be controlled, as the situation improves and the economy starts picking up, this will be a good way to enhance Singapore's space. When I say Singapore, it applies also for all the expats who are sitting in Singapore. So if they have a responsibility for China or business in China or opportunity in China, they can start to utilize these special green lane arrangements. We are under discussion also with Australia and New Zealand, our southern neighbors who've done very well in handling this crisis. We're also discussing with Vietnam, which is a big market of which Singapore has been very close friends for many years. And so we are looking towards opening up special arrangements for business travel, especially, that will allow the Singapore hub status to be coming back into effect as soon as possible. To be frank, and we can discuss this later, we are discussing about ASEAN as a group. That's ideal from the business point of view. But as I mentioned about Indonesia, there are some question marks about how much we can really trust their public health numbers and their state of control over the COVID problem. As such, they're probably in the second rank of countries we will need to discuss how to open with. But the point I want to return to is that we're very aware of the need to resume this hub status, to find a way towards the new economy, the online, to improve our infrastructure, and to also go through the turmoil of these increased Sino-American tensions to preserve the international rule-based trading order. Please allow me to stop here. There are more points, but we can return to them if anything is of particular interest to the people taking part in this seminar. Thank you again.
Thank you so much, Professor Tai. Thank you to your Singapore Institute for International Affairs. I think you presented a very wide and wise framework of the situation, and I think it was really very useful for all of us. We have now some time for a conversation among the people attending this webinar. You can ask the floor to the organizer of the webinar, and then we will give you the floor. I ask you to be short in your questions or comments, to keep your comments in no more than 2 minutes each. I'll start with Pietro Ginefra, who is the representative of the Bank of Italy in Singapore. Pietro, you have the floor.
So good afternoon to everyone. Thank you very much for giving the opportunity of sharing some ideas about what happening in this area. And I would like to stress something that has already been told. The first thing is that the health system in Singapore has been robust enough to minimize the COVID casualties. The second thing is that for Singapore, international trade is very important. And this can be the weakness of what happened, because COVID is trying to kill trade policy, international policy, trade. Peter Navarro, special advisor to the President of the United States, suggested to President Trump to minimize the dependency on the global supply chain for medicines and medical equipment. This would mean to reshore the majority of these productions to the consumers' countries. And this is a big problem for everyone, is a hub, or it's in the middle of international exchanges. We have 2 points of view, the economic problem and the political problem. The self-sufficiency in essential products would be a costly error. At this moment, as we have seen before, WTO forecasts that the collapse in trade could be far bigger than in response to 2008 financial crisis. And it could be worse if policymakers could curb the imports to react to declining exports. During the crisis, we saw restrictions to the exports of medical and pharmaceutical supplies consistent with the WHO agreements. But unfortunately, limiting the exports of these products is not the answer to the lack of supplies. It only shifts shortages to the countries with the least capacity. Trying to become self-sufficient implies to lose the opportunities offered by the economies of scale and limit the robustness of the economic system, its capacity to maintain operations during a crisis. In a pandemic, it is necessary to have access to essential supplies to continue production. To get robustness, it is necessary to diversify suppliers across multiple locations, and producing in one place makes higher the concentration risk. Importing increases the potential number of suppliers and the access to surplus stocks. Protection, on the contrary, concentrates risk domestically, reduces the diversity of potential suppliers, and diminishes the pressure of competition and economies of scale. The capacity of South Korea to supply COVID test kits globally show how robust was the supply chain in health products, but that requires international networks, skilled supply chain managers, reactivity, and agility. This type of experience does not come from local production and activities shielded from competition. So what could be done? There should be national and global efforts to identify essential products in the event of various emergencies. There would then be the monitoring of relevant supply chains and inventories, both domestically and globally. A body like an International Energy Agency, well-funded national and global bodies working alongside the private industry. The last thing is about globalization. International trade is a public good. Policymakers have to guarantee its integrity. Integration of production is part of globalization. Globalization is a fragile process and its ecosystem is very vulnerable. There are too many interests at stake. Left behind people could be easily manipulated to fight against globalization. Digital divide could be easily misinterpreted as a globalization divide instead of a technological divide. Multinational organizations are showing to be too weak to manage international crises. WHO has been late in giving medical instruction. IMF and World Bank are supporting economies, but they cannot exercise political leadership. We need strong political leaderships to manage the crisis and redistribute losses across citizens according to politically fair principles. Otherwise, the fragile international equilibria that allowed globalization in the 90s, thanks to the Bill Clinton administration and Alan Greenspan leadership, could be challenged, and the outcome could be not attractive. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Pietro. I would like to give the floor now to the President of the Chamber of Commerce, Alberto Martinelli. Thank you very much, Alberto, for being with us. You have the floor.
Thank you, Presidente. My question, I would like to hook up with what was said by Mr. Ambassador Langella. Singapore is a hub and is interconnected, and by Mr. Tai, Singapore aims to reconnect as soon as possible. As a Chamber of Commerce, we foresee quite an interaction between ASEAN and EU, despite all tensions. And so, how much are we going to leverage between Singapore, which is representing an ASEAN hub, and the Italian ports, for instance, Trieste, which can serve not only Italy, but also the Eastern European countries? How much do you think we can leverage further on this unique maritime link, which is also, if I do well remember, included in the One Belt Road, in the Chinese One Belt Road? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alberto. Thank you, President Martinelli. I think now I can give the floor to Ambassador Langella and then to Professor Tai for some reactions. Raffaele, if you are ready, you have the floor.
Well, there has been already quite a strong cooperation between Singapore and Italian authorities. I would like to remind you that Singapore is already present in Genoa. They invested quite massively in Genoa, and some months ago, I think about 1 year ago, a delegation from PSA, that is the Singaporean Port Authority, went to Trieste also to explore new opportunities of cooperation. Of course, Singapore for us will be the perfect partner in order to strengthen our system, because it's a way to strengthen the system without any political attachment, which is I mean, the most dangerous shortcoming of other initiatives in this kind with other partners. PSA is very well aware of the importance of Italy in the Mediterranean area, and they are willing to do more. And with them, we have quite a strong partnership, and the dialogue is very intense. Not only the port itself is very important. I mean, there is also the whole sector of shipping, oil and gas, and so on, which rely in some way on the port and its activities, and they've been flourishing for decades now. Now the situation is not so good for I would say international and global reasons, which are not linked exclusively to Singapore, but I'm sure that the cooperation will restart very soon in the most fruitful way. Thank you.
Could add to that about the port first, may I? First, I would say that ambassadors put it very well. The trade as a whole has come down. Now, when it starts to come up, and it won't go up sharply, the question is who is quicker and more efficient to get moving. And I'm quite confident that Singapore has always faced a lot of cost pressures, and so our time and turnaround and our efficiency have been honed. So as international trade starts to resume, not at the same level, I think we will have the lower cost and the quicker time to respond. PSA, in fact, are good friends of the institutes, and they are reached not only into Italy, they have a share in the port of Trieste, which is with China, as part of the One Belt and One Road. And globally, they're linked up. In our region too, they have been looking for investments and have a number of them to connect directly to wharves or ports they have a management stake in across our region. So I think this part, this is what I mean by building that infrastructure, not just in Singapore, but that connected infrastructure. And I think there'll be more thinking, because it is by only a small coincidence that the global head of PSA is a co-chair of that emerging stronger task force I talked about. This task force has one minister and largely the private sector. We believe there are a number of trends which we must adjust to, and that we will put money, policy, and thought into how to adjust quickly to the world that's coming. I want to make one more point, if I may. I think the banker was absolutely correct. I'm sorry, I've forgotten your name, but about the emergency and the clampdown of medical equipment. I want to tell you that Singapore actually observed the rule of law and fulfilled all its contracts. We actually have a plant here run by an American company where the American president tried to basically take all the products for America. We told the company they cannot do this. They had to give not to Singapore, but to whoever they've contracted to do so. On our part, even when we had some question marks over shortages, the Singapore government never stopped the export of materials for other people to make masks or otherwise try to grab them for ourselves. So we've tried to be consistent with our belief that shortages, as you said very well, if you keep too much for yourself, we will end up with shortages elsewhere. So now on the ASEAN side, we are working towards coming up with basically a float, understanding the needs and coming up with a floating reserve of essential medical equipment. And of course, we'll also work with other people like EU to maybe buy vaccines. I mean, Singapore population is small. We have the money. So if the vaccine is developed by you or by other people, we're willing to work with people to make sure that our island is safe.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Tai. I would like to add a question for both of you that is a very easy and very short question. I don't know if the answer is easy, but the question is about the ASEAN cooperation and the ASEAN infrastructure, institutional infrastructure. My question is, was the ASEAN cooperation strengthened or weakened in these 4 months? Because we had the same discussion in Europe, and in Europe, the discussion and the relationship between member states and the European Union framework was one of the most important part of the reaction to the COVID pandemic, to the sanitary part of the problem, but first of all to the recession. So I would like to know what was the level of the cooperation among ASEAN countries and what was the role of the ASEAN General Secretariat and the ASEAN leadership during these 4 months. Raffaele.
Thank you. There's been for sure a special summit dedicated to COVID-19. Of course, it was a virtual summit. There has been also a meeting of the foreign ministers. So from political point of view, the cooperation has been quite wide and fruitful. Nothing comparable to what happened in Europe, of course, because the infrastructure is completely different, and I mean, that would have been impossible and maybe even pointless. But I mean, from the political point of view, the cooperation was very good, and in my opinion, the structure of ASEAN has been strengthened quite a lot by the crisis. The dialogue between single members of the organization maybe could have been better on some issues. For instance, the closure of frontiers and the free movement of people. But all in all, I will say ASEAN is coming out from this crisis stronger than before.
Yes, I don't mean to echo you, but I think my views are quite similar. Now, I want to be very frank and tell you that when the crisis first started happening, frankly, like a lot of parts of the world, there was panic. And none of us were at our finest moment. I think, when Italy went through that initial weeks as well, you faced that problem with the EU. And let's be honest about it. I think this idea of regionalism is still, I mean, for us, especially ASEAN, a secondary factor. It is not our primary. We look first to our governments first. And I think this is a phenomenon we've seen across the world because there's been no real strong global leadership. Now, after the initial panic, we've started to realize that the regional frame is the second best option. The first is still global. But if we can't get the global cooperation we need, we're still fighting with WHO, etc., then the regions make a lot of sense. And so we have made a renewed effort in ASEAN. Now, as Ambassador said very well, our ambitions are not as high level as EU. So we won't be trying to put a special budget to help everybody. That's not the way ASEAN works. But if you look at each country, within their means, they're spending a sizable amount of money. Indonesia, Singapore, Malaysia has spent more percentage-wise than Singapore. Thailand has put a large number of money in too. Now, some of them have reserves, some of them don't. But we're not going to talk about Singapore spending to help Indonesia. We will give, of course, medical test kits, etc., but not budgetary support. So we're not as ambitious as I've seen discussions in the EU take us. But other level, besides the political, is the working level. We have a system now in ASEAN where very practical information is being shared by emergency response centers in each country, by medical and public health authorities. So we're trying to get the real numbers and really share lessons. The next step also will be, I think, of tracing across borders. We want to have a Bluetooth, a blue system for testing and tracing. Now, given that, I want to admit one thing, and maybe ask our Europeans, I can't quite understand it. Some countries in our region have done very well health-wise, and others like Indonesia, I frankly have concerns. Indonesian friends have concern about their own status. So right now, we're none of us talking about pan-ASEAN opening. We're more likely, as I said, to open to China, Australia, New Zealand, maybe Vietnam. But I understand from Europeans, you're going to open right up to everyone in Europe. And this despite the fact that some countries seem to have very few cases, and others have gone through quite a lot and may still have pockets of numbers. So I guess it's a different approach. We are being more selective because our diversity is really in our face, how we've dealt with some of the problems.
Thank you very much, Professor Tai. We are at the end of our conversation. I think this webinar was very useful for our associates, for companies, firms, association of entrepreneurs, and other institutional representatives that were involved in this seminar. I think it was very interesting also to understand your views around the cooperation among the different ASEAN countries and the perspectives that you envisage for the next future. I would like to thank you all. I would like to thank Ambassador Langella and to thank Professor Simon Tai for your cooperation. I'd like also to thank Pietro Ginefra and Alberto Martinelli for their interventions. I underline the fact that in the next days we will have two other very important rendezvous. One, as I said at the very beginning, is the webinar on the Thai situation. It will be a webinar like the one we are having now. And the other one will be the rendezvous that we will have Fridays, the 2nd of July, Thursday, the 2nd of July. So the 2nd of July, we will have the big event organized by Italy-ASEAN Association and Ambrosetti. We were supposed to be in Malaysia. I take advantage also to thank the ambassador, the Malaysian ambassador to Italy, because he is with us in this webinar, and thank him also for the cooperation, because we were supposed to be in Malaysia to have our big summit, Economic Italy ASEAN Summit, as we had last year in Hanoi, as we had in Singapore in 2018, and as we had in Jakarta in 2017. Fortunately, we are not able, of course, to be in Kuala Lumpur, but we will have a webinar organized the morning of July the 2nd. I think it will be the opportunity to keep our high-level dialogue, Italy-ASEAN high-level dialogue organized by Ambrosetti and the Italy-ASEAN Association alive and ready to start again next year with physical presence, we hope, in Malaysia and then in the other countries. So wait for you for these two next webinar. Thank you so much, Raffaele. Thank you so much, Professor Tai, and take care.
Thank you. Keep safe. Thank you.
Thank you.